It's February 7th, 2018, and this is your scripture reading and devotional for today. The scripture reading today is Exodus chapters 18 and 19, Mark chapter 14, verses 1 through 42, Psalm 19, 7 through 14, and Proverbs 4, 3 through 4. The devotional today is a clip from the lesson Remember This Day from Exodus chapter 13 and verse 3.
In Exodus chapter 13, you have come to the part of Exodus from which the book really gets its name when the children of Israel are departing from Egypt. They had seen the 10 plagues that God brought upon Egypt, and that 10th plague had just taken place. And the Egyptians had begged the children of Israel to leave Egypt. Even though all through that section, every time Moses and Aaron would go to Pharaoh, it says that Pharaoh would harden his heart, and it says that the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, and that Pharaoh hardened his own heart, and it's used interchangeably, and we understand there that when it says that the Lord hardened Pharaoh's heart, it was that God was using the kind of person Pharaoh was in the situation that he was in to accomplish his will. And when you go through the 10 plagues there and you see what was accomplished in the 10 plagues, we understand that the will of God in that situation was to demonstrate His superiority, His might against the false gods of Egypt. Every one of those plagues was a direct attack against the false gods of Egypt. And they had gone through the plague of the waters becoming blood, the plague of the frogs, and the plague of lice, the flies, and the livestock being diseased, and the plague of boils, and the hail that had destroyed the crops. And then after the hail, what was left of the crops was destroyed with the plague of locusts. And after those first 9 plagues, God is now ready to demonstrate His power in a final way against Egypt with the death of the firstborn, or after the 9th plague of darkness. That plague of darkness is very significant, as all of them are, but that plague of darkness was against the head of their pantheon, if you will, the main god of the Egyptians, the god Ra, who was pictured as the sun god. And they had this image of Ra, that when the sun came up in the morning and progressed through the sky during the day to the time it went down in the evening, that Ra was dragging the sun behind his chariot. And without Ra to bring the sun up and to take the sun down, then there wouldn't be the continuation of days. And so God showed His power over Ra by doing away with light. And in the mind of the Egyptians, that would have been basically the effect of God saying, see, if I don't want the sun to come out, the sun's not coming out. Ra can't do anything about it. And so He was demonstrating His power against the false gods of Egypt. And then He announces the death of the firstborn, and tells Moses to go in and tell Pharaoh, or to send to Pharaoh, to have Pharaoh told that if he didn't let the children of Israel go, then there would not be a house in Egypt where death would be escaped. That in every house, the firstborn of that house would die, except for those houses that had the blood of the Passover lamb applied to the doorposts of the house. And it says that when the destroyer would come, back in Exodus chapter 12, that when the destroyer would come, that he would see the blood on the doorposts of those houses, and he would pass over those houses. That is, the destroyer that was going to kill the firstborn in Egypt. He wouldn't go into those houses where the blood had been applied to the doorposts. And so, in acknowledgement of that, they are given the Passover observance. And it says in chapter 13 and verse 3, "And Moses said to the people, Remember this day in which you went out of Egypt, out of the house of bondage, for by strength of hand the Lord brought you out of this place. No leavened bread shall be eaten." And so it's referred to as the Feast of Unleavened Bread, the observance of the Passover. And it was to memorialize their deliverance from bondage. There's a great deal that we can learn about that statement, "Remember this day," there in Exodus chapter 13 and verse 3. First of all, the Hebrews were to remember the day that God had delivered them from bondage in Egypt. They were to remember that. There was to be an annual observance. This Passover feast was supposed to be eaten year by year throughout the generations of the children of Israel to memorialize that day that God had brought them out of Egypt. Go back to Exodus chapter 12, beginning with verse 23. And it says there, "For the Lord will pass through to strike the Egyptians, and when he sees the blood on the lintel and on the two doorposts, the Lord will pass over the door and not allow the destroyer to come into your houses to strike you." Now, I don't know what translation. I don't think there is a translation that has death angel there, but people sure do like to talk about that death angel. The Bible doesn't talk about a death angel. It's a destroyer. The destroyer would enter that house, except where God saw the blood applied to the doorpost, and he would not allow the destroyer to enter into that house. And so he says in verse 24, "And you shall observe this thing as an ordinance for you and your sons forever. It will come to pass when you come to the land which the Lord will give you, just as he promised, that you shall keep this service. And it shall be when your children say to you, What do you mean by this service?" And so their observance of the Passover year by year was an opportunity for them to teach their children about what God did for them in bringing them out of Egypt. And so he says, "You shall say, It is the Passover sacrifice of the Lord, who passed over the houses of the children of Israel in Egypt when he struck the Egyptians and delivered our households." So the people bowed their heads and worshiped. Then the children of Israel went away and did so just as the Lord had commanded Moses and Aaron, so they did.
Be sure to post your thoughts from today's reading in the comment section below.